The wooden door creaked open slowly, and the moment Jack stepped inside the stilt house with a basket still on his shoulder, his entire body froze. She was already there, sitting calmly at the small wooden table, dressed in elegance that didn't belong to this humble place, her posture straight, her eyes sharp, her presence heavy enough to suffocate the entire room without saying a single word. Jack's mother, Tử Tiên, who had just stepped in behind him, almost bumped into his back when he suddenly stopped, her hand still holding the edge of the basket, her breath catching when she followed his gaze and saw the woman sitting inside their home like she owned it. For a moment, no one spoke. The air tightened. "You're back," his mother said calmly, lifting her teacup as if she had been waiting for hours, and she probably had. Jack slowly put the basket down. His expression hardened. "What are you doing here?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, her eyes shifted slightly toward Tử Tiên, scanning her from head to toe. Her simple clothes, her tired face, her bare hands still stained from handling fruit all day. Disapproval. Clear. Unhidden. "I wanted to see what kind of life you chose," she said finally. Jack stepped slightly to the side, instinctively placing himself between the two women. "You've seen it. Now you can leave." Tử Tiên glanced at him, surprised by how direct he was. But his mother only smiled faintly. "Still stubborn," she said, setting the cup down gently. "Just like when you were a child." Jack didn't respond, as he knew. She didn't come here just to see. "Sit," she gestured. Neither of them moved. The silence stretched. Then she continued, her tone colder now. "I didn't come all this way to argue. I came to fix this." Jack's eyes darkened. "There's nothing to fix." "There is," she said firmly. "You." The word hit harder than expected. Tử Tiên lowered her gaze slightly. Jack didn't. "I'm not broken," he replied. His mother let out a small breath, as if disappointed. "You gave up everything," she said. "Your position, your future, your responsibility." "I chose my life. You abandoned it." Jack took a step forward. "I didn't abandon anything. I left something that was destroying me. And this," she looked around the small house. "This is better?" Jack didn't hesitate. Yes, that answer was final, but not for her. She stood up slowly, walked a few steps closer. Her heels echoed softly against the wooden floor. "And what about her?" she asked, glancing toward Tử Tiên. "Do you really think this life is good for her?" Jack's jaw tightened. "She's not part of your decision. Everything you do affects her," she replied sharply. Then, turning fully toward Tử Tiên for the first time, "I want to talk to you." The words were polite, but the tone wasn't. Tử Tiên hesita. Jack immediately stepped forward. "No, you can say whatever you want here." His mother's eyes narrowed slightly. "This is between me and her." "There is no between," Jack said firmly. "Whatever you want to say it in front of me." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Tử Tiên gently touched Jack's arm. "It's okay," she said softly. Jack turned to her. "It's not." She gave a small shake of her head. "I'll be fine." He didn't believe that. Not for a second. But before he could argue again, his mother had already turned and walked toward the door. "Come," she said. Tử Tiên phun lao. Slowly. And the moment they stepped outside, the air changed. The yard was quiet. The wind moved lightly through the trees. But there was nothing peaceful about what was about to happen. His mother stopped, turned, and the softness in her expression disappeared completely. "You think you can keep him here?" she asked coldly. Tử Tiên didn't answer. She just stood there, listening. "You don't belong in his world," she continued. "And he doesn't belong in yours." Her words were sharp, precise. "You're holding him back." Tử Tien's fingers tightened slightly at her sides. "He gave up everything for you," she said. "Do you even understand what that means?" Tử Tiên xoa lao, but stayed silent. "Or do you just enjoy it?" his mother added. "Living off him while pretending to be strong?" That one cut deeper. Tử Tiên ice chamber. "I don't." "You don't what?" she interrupted. "You don't have money. You don't have status. You don't have anything." Every word landed heavier than the last. And yet, You're the reason he lost everything." The tears came before she could stop them. "I didn't ask him to." "But you didn't stop him either," his mother said coldly. Silence, broken only by Tử Tien's unsteady breathing. "You think love is enough?" she continued. "Love doesn't protect. Love doesn't provide. Love doesn't survive in the real world." Tử Tien lowered her head, tears falling freely now, because deep down, there was a part of her that feared those words might be true. Inside the house, Jack stood still, but something felt wrong. Too quiet, too long. His chest tightened, and without thinking he moved. Fast. The door opened sharply, and what he saw stopped him. Tử Tien standing there, crying, his mother in front of her, cold, unmoved. That was enough. Jack stepped forward immediately. Without hesitation, he pulled Tử Tien into his arms, holding her tightly, protecting her, like nothing else mattered. "Enough." His voice was low but firm. Tử Tien buried her face into his chest, her shoulders shaking. Jack's hand gently held the back of her head. His eyes lifted to his mother, and this time, there was no hesitation. "No more," he said. The air went still. "You came here. You said what you wanted, now leave." His mother stared at him, silent, but her eyes changed. "You're choosing this?" she asked quietly. Jack didn't look away. "I already did." A long pause. Heavy. Then don't call me when you regret it." Jack's grip tightened slightly around Tử Tien. "I won't." That answer closed something. For good. His mother's expression hardened completely. Without another word, she turned, walked away, each step firm, final, the sound of her heels fading into the distance. But before she disappeared, she stopped briefly, pulled out her phone, looked at the screen, then made a call. Her voice was low, controlled. "Do it." And then she hung up, without looking back. Inside the yard, Jack still held Tử Tien. Her tears slowly began to calm, but the silence that followed was heavier than before, because neither of them knew what that call meant, and whether this was truly the end, or just the beginning of something far more dangerous. The wind felt colder after she left. It wasn't the kind of cold that came from the mountains or the night air, but something heavier, something that settled into the silence she had left behind, something that neither Jack nor Tử Tien could ignore, no matter how tightly they held onto each other in that moment, as if by staying close they could stop whatever was coming next. Jack didn't move. He kept his arms around her, one hand resting gently on the back of her head, the other holding her shoulder, steady, protective, unwilling to let go even when her breathing slowly calmed and her tears began to fade into quiet sobs. "I'm sorry," she whispered against his chest, her voice small, fragile. Jack frowned immediately. "No." She shook her head slightly. "I shouldn't have let you." "No," he repeated, more firmly this time, pulling her back just enough to look at her face, his eyes serious, unwavering. "Don't say that." Tử Tiên avoid his gaze. But he didn't let her. He lifted her chin gently. "You didn't take anything from me," he said. "I chose this. I chose you." Her eyes trembled. "But your mother." "My mother doesn't decide my life," Jack cut in, his voice calm but absolute. "Ido." There was no anger in his tone now, only clarity, only certainty. And for the first time since everything happened, Tử Tien saw it clearly. He wasn't struggling between two worlds anymore. He had already chosen his side. Inside the house, the silence followed them in. Jack closed the door behind them slowly, as if trying to shut out everything that had just happened, everything that had been said, everything that still lingered in the air like an invisible weight. Tử Tien wiped her face gently, trying to steady herself, but her hands still trembled. Jack noticed. He stepped closer again. "You don't have to be strong all the time," he said quietly. She let out a small breath. "I'm not strong right now." "That's okay." He didn't try to fix it, didn't try to give solutions. He just stayed, and that helped more than anything. They sat down on the wooden floor side by side, not speaking for a while, just listening to the quiet of the house, the faint sound of wind outside, the creaking of wood, the rhythm of breathing slowly returning to normal. But even in that quiet, Something was different. Not broken, but aware. Because both of them knew this wasn't over. What did she mean? Tử Tiên asked finally, her voice low. Jack didn't answer immediately, because he knew exactly what she was talking about. The call. The words. Do it. He leaned back slightly, his eyes unfocused for a moment. I don't know, he said honestly. But that wasn't entirely true. He had a feeling, and that feeling wasn't good. Night fell faster than usual, or at least it felt that way. The sky darkened, the village lights dim, the world outside growing quieter. But inside Jack's mind, thoughts moved faster, sharper, connecting pieces he wished didn't fit together. His mother didn't make empty threats. She never had. If she said something, it meant something was already in motion. A sudden sound broke the silence. Knocking. Sharp. Unexpected. Both of them froze. Jack stood up immediately. Tử Tien's eyes followed him, a flicker of unease crossing her face. Stay here, he said softly. She shook her head. No. But she didn't move closer. She just watched. Jack walked to the door, paused for a second, then opened it. Two men stood outside, dressed simply, but their posture, their presence, didn't belong to the village. We're looking for Jack, one of them said. Jack's eyes narrowed slightly. That's me. The man gave a small nod. You need to come with us. Silence. Tử Tiên stepped closer now, standing just behind Jack. Who are you? She asked. The men didn't answer her. Their attention stayed on Jack. It's important. Jack didn't move. For what? A brief pause. Then, your mother sent us. There it was. Confirmation. The air shifted instantly. Tử Tien's hand tightened slightly on Jack's sleeve. Jack glanced back at her. Just for a second. Then forward again. I'm not going anywhere, he said. The men exchanged a look. This isn't a request. Jack's expression hardened. Then you can tell her. She should have asked me herself. The tension rose sharply. The men took a small step forward. Not aggressive, but not passive either. We don't want to cause trouble. Jack let out a quiet breath. Then don't. Silence. Heavy. Uncomfortable. Unresolved. Behind him, Tử Tien stepped closer. Without thinking, she reached for his hand, held it firmly. Jack felt it, and in that moment, something inside him settled again. Not fear, not doubt, but resolve. The men noticed. Their eyes shifted briefly between the two of them. Then one of them spoke again. You're making this harder than it needs to be. Jack shook his head slightly. No, he said. You are. Another pause. Longer this time. Then, without another word, the men stepped back, turned, and walked away into the darkness. But not quickly. Not defeated. Just postponed. Jack stood there for a few seconds longer, watching, thinking, then slowly closed the door. Inside, the silence returned. But it wasn't the same silence as before. This one was waiting. Tử Tien didn't let go of his hand. This is because of me, she said quietly. Jack turned to her. No. She shook her head. If I wasn't here, then I wouldn't be either, he said. She stopped. He stepped closer. Listen to me. His voice softened. This isn't something we run from. Her eyes searched his. Then what do we do? Jack didn't answer immediately, because the truth was, he didn't have a plan. Not yet. But he knew one thing. He wasn't going back. Not like this. We stay, he said finally. Simple. But not easy. Tử Tien looked at him for a long moment. Then slowly, she nodded. Outside, the night deepened. The village slept. But somewhere far away, in a place filled with lights and power and decisions made without emotion, Jack's mother stood by the window, her phone still in her hand, her expression unreadable. They refused, a voice said from the other end. She didn't react. Then we moved to the next step. Her tone was calm, too calm, and as she ended the call, her reflection in the glass looked colder than ever. Back in the small stilt house, Jack and Tử Tien sat together in the dim light, their hands still intertwined, their world small but real. For now, because love had won this moment. But the fight, had only just begun, and whether they could truly stay together would depend on what came next.